Game Dev Discussion Podcast. This week, we have Evan McKnight, lead asset artist at Counterplay Games, and actually my boss, I guess, right? You're my lead. Hey, dude, cheers for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
So we were just talking off air a little bit, and it's kind of it's an interesting discussion. We're talking about prop art and asset art. I want to start with, let's just define the term asset art, like we were just doing. Can you just sort of recap some of that again?
Yeah, so we were just talking about the term prop art versus asset art, and how we were talking about, like, I think when people hear prop artist, they usually have a very specific image in mind, and that's of like someone creating like smaller, more inconsequential props, crates, barrels, little things like that. And so that's why I kind of prefer to use the term asset art, because in most cases it's broader than that. But you could be tasked with tackling like many different types of assets. Bigger companies like that have higher headcounts and can hire like potentially more like specific roles might have, like, you are just like a prop artist, you're responsible for maybe setting up like destruction and dynamics and all that stuff. Like, it's broader than just like creating it. You're sort of like setting everything up and making sure that all works with gameplay. So and that's like can be a very technical role. Like what I've done in my career mostly has been environment art, but it's always sort of been on the asset side of things. So like modeling and texturing and material creation and one-to-one bakes, but also using trim sheets and modular workflow. And so it's like a very broad term. So I prefer to use the terminology asset artist rather than prop artist, at least for like our team currently, because it's very broad. Everyone's doing a bit of everything, and I think if people aren't really familiar with like what we're doing, if you hear prop artists, it's like, oh, okay, like they're only doing like small stuff, or they're only doing like one-to-one bakes, which is barely the case.
It's funny because I am the same. I hear prop art and I'm like, okay, one-to-ones, and it's like it's the entry level. Like when you get into 3D for the first time, you're only looking at the one-to-ones. But when we think of like props in a game, you have to figure out solutions. And I guess that's where, like, I guess with you started environment art and you led into like the asset art side of stuff. It's because them solutions come hand in hand with each other. You can't work with an environment without having these clever solutions, trim sheets, tilables, decals, whatever it might be. Have you noticed, and this is something, I mean, maybe it's because it's my time at Deco working with outsource, and I know you work closely with outsource as well. It's kind of the skill people almost forget about. People want to make this really sexy, one-to-one, beautiful render of a prop, which is great. It looks really cool. But it's like, you're not showcasing a lot of the skills that you actually need in the games industry. You need to, make this texture go across all of the props, not just one. And there's a bit of an absence for that right now, right?
Yeah, I mean, like for myself, if I'm looking at like portfolios, and if you can demonstrate that you can do a one-to-one prop really well, and I can tell that you have like a good artistic eye and a good eye for like scale of detail and color theory and all those foundations, like that's still like really important. But it's like rarely in production do you create assets like that, unless you're like creating a cinematic asset that's going to be used in like a close-up camera shot or something. But that's pretty rare in game development. Like, so a lot of times, and this is something that I don't see a lot in like junior portfolios, is the ability to sort of demonstrate that you can build something on a larger scale to like production quality using like a smart workflow, trim sheets, or maybe face weighted normals using tiling textures or something like that, maybe with some like interesting shader, like a vert blend or something where you can blend between textures, so you can get that unique detail, but also sort of maintain textile density and all that stuff. So
was that like the reason you found do you think you find yourself naturally going into asset art? Like because there is a certain level of satisfaction where it's like, okay, I have two props here. One's a one to make, it looks amazing. The other is super efficient, optimized, and reusable, but it looks just as good. Like there's a certain level of satisfaction there in problem solving. Does that appeal to you?
Yeah, I think I've always been like, I guess over the course of my career, I've been probably more focused uh, on details, like focused on the specifics of like assets, and getting a little bit like closer in on something and making sure that looks awesome. Um, that's sort of why I ended up transitioning from like broader environments more to like asset art, and then I spent some time doing like as a hard surface artist, like, and then doing characters and weapons and vehicles, where I could really just focus in on that stuff, um, and just like you're making like a really nice portfolio piece, which is motivating, like when you're working on something and you can be like, oh, okay, like I could actually just display this by itself and it would be a great portfolio piece. I think that's like probably one of the biggest motivators we have as artists. If you do have ownership over something, you're going to do better work, and you're probably going to put in a little bit of extra time.
It's funny though, like, don't you find just this reminds me of something back with the Deco days when you're dealing with like props and these individual things. We spoke a little bit off air about it. It's that everything's not a portfolio piece. It's like, you get some of the younger artists that like they'll be working with like I don't know, some clutter props, and like they're making this really focused time where you're like, dude, it's gonna be underneath some dirt textures hidden in the corner. It's okay. Like that's the biggest thing I think a lot of people find is like when they enter the industry, they've gone from this like, I mean, it's like when you were first trying to get in the industry, you're churning out work so hard and you're working so hard to make everything absolutely pristine. Then when you enter industry, it's like, sometimes it's not like that. Sometimes it's a little bit more hacky, a little bit more solutions, not so much everything has to be perfect.
I think that can be shocking to like some people when they first start like get their first job. Like how rough certain things can be in game development. But at the end of the day, like, and this is what I always try to encourage, like, my team members and students to do is, when you're working on something, the most important thing is to get it into the game as soon as possible, and view it from the player camera, like how you're going to be viewing it in game, because that's going to influence how you're texturing or modeling. If you've got like a third person camera and you're working on a smaller prop or something, that your bevels might read great when you're zoomed right into it in like Maya viewport or Blender, but you get it in the game and then you view it from the third person camera and everything's razor sharp, and now your texture doesn't look as good because like it's mipping, and so that's always something that I'm like a big proponent of. Like I encourage that a lot, is get it in as soon as possible, look at it how you'll be viewing it in the game, because that'll, like, that's the most important part for figuring out how you're going to tackle something. And also right away you'll be able to tell, okay, how much effort do I actually have to put into this.
Yeah, I was thinking about this with portfolios, like so for example, like whenever I start a new environment for a portfolio piece, when I'm blocking out, I'll work out exactly what my camera shots are going to be, because then I know where to focus my energy. That being said, just coming back to what you just mentioned with the whole like play through the player's eyes and this kind of stuff, is it odd what we have to do as pre-industry people, where you're jumping through the hoops to try and get that first job? You're creating these beautiful compositions, which are great, but don't actually replicate much of what you're going to be doing once you get into the game, unless you actually go in playing with a third-person camera, and they're the portfolios which I like, are the ones where they get the UE3, the UE4 man like in the scene, so I guess with context, the shapes and stuff. I was thinking about this in terms of like, it's almost like some of the shots we create for portfolios are more for cinema, with them shots where you don't get to control. It's like, this is what you get to see. Because I had a really interesting conversation with Randall Mackey, an ex-colleague, and he was talking about how he's a games concept artist, and he was like, I prefer film these days. I was like, why? And he went, well, I get to dictate what you look at. Like, I curate exactly what you look at as an audience. Whereas games, you can look wherever you want. You spend too much time looking at something, not enough time. And I was thinking about portfolios, and it's like, we kind of do a similar thing, right? Like, you curate this beautiful shot, but games, you don't get to curate much. The player has autonomy to do what they want. And it's just something that's bugged me for a while. I thought about it, I was like, is this good? Is this bad? Like, does it even matter?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just the challenge of like the medium, like, and it's a different mindset. Like in production and game development, you do have a lot of limitations. You have to work with design, making sure everything works with gameplay. Uh, uh, you have to work like within the confines of, just all this the structure of the game that you're working on. And so it's sort of refreshing if you're doing a personal piece to just be like, okay, like I don't have any of those restrictions anymore. Like just make a really nice composition and go more cinematic. Like I think at the end of the
Mm.
day, the games industry is pushing that way anyway. Like we're trying to become more closer to film, trying to become more cinematic as time goes on anyway. So
That line is getting more blurred, isn't it? Like, especially the UE5
it's
stuff.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't know. I'm still like, it seems too good to be true to me.
Yeah.
Like it looks awesome, but I don't know like if hard drives are big enough to handle like 1 million polygon models all the time. It's going to be, your hard drive's going to
Yeah.
fill up pretty quick, but it's super, like, I mean, it's super exciting tech.
Yeah, and all the test cases, like, yeah, it works in Fortnite, and I'm like, Fortnite, it's a good taste test basis, but not all games are that simple in, like,
Mm-hmm.
content. One other thing I was curious to pick your brains on, being a lead asset artist. Speaking working with outsource before I was at Counterplay, something I heard quite a lot from a lot of the guys, my fellow leads, was outsourcing is becoming more and more reliable. I think that's the word to use, because outsourcing has been around for years. It's been around, for
Yeah.
past 15 years, but it's gotten more reliable. It's become far more of an option to younger artists. Could you see that being the way the industry goes, in terms of, we have prop artists, and there's just, if you want to be a prop artist, you work for outsource, and that's how we can handle it. And in the future, asset artists, i.e., the ones coming up with clever solutions, the problem solving, is going to be in house. And what's your thoughts on that as an asset artist, like, in a guy who's obviously dealing a lot with outsource?
Yeah, I mean, I've already been seeing that for maybe like the last 5 years. A lot of cases of studios that might have like a fairly small internal team of like asset artists or people that are actually doing the modeling and the texturing and model creation, and then relying like really heavily on either external development or outsourcing or whatever you want to call it. And in most cases, as an internal artist, your job is sort of like to define the visual target and to also create like examples and of like the quality bar or like how you want to build something. So you might have a case where you have like a whole tile set, and maybe you'll create a couple of those, like maybe two pieces or something, just to sort of showcase like this is sort of what we want like across the whole tile set. And then they'll send out the work order to whatever external company you're using, and they'll create the rest of it, and then you'll sort of communicate with them as they're building it, to make sure everything's like the right style and the right under like the technical restrictions and everything like that. So um,
Is
I
it
do
good?
agree that I, I I do agree that like it is empowering being like that, being that problem solver and um, having to kind of tackle those challenges and figure out solutions. But um, there are cases where I'm like, it is every once in a while. I'm like, I wish I could just spend a week or two and just like, model a hero asset or something
Mm.
and just do the whole thing. But with like production cycle timelines and how everything costs so much, like a lot of times you're like, you don't have the time to do that. So you're
Mm.
like, okay, like I've got a vision and maybe I'll create the high poly and then we'll send that out. Or maybe like I'll just do texture polish when we get it back, or material polishing or something like that. So in my job now, rarely do I actually take something from start to finish. It's sort of like I'm directing, and I might pick up like at a certain point along the way in the workflow, but it's usually not all the way through, which I mean is I kind of missed that, but I also now have a lot of like creative input sort of across
Mm.
like the whole project, which is really empowering and is quite refreshing.
I was gonna say, how have you found that transition, like from because I've this is the message I hear quite often from like leads. I
Hmm.
mean, when I did Deco as well, I had a similar like mindset of I still want to kind of make art, and I was like, like how do I feel about this? The management side's cool, but then it's frustrating at the same
Yeah,
time.
yeah,
Like overall, like how you found it? How's the transition been from being like, okay, I'm a production artist,
right.
I'm a lead, not a production artist, and I can't, because the other side of it as well, I guess, is like you see if you're working with people in teams, like I want to do the thing, but you sort of got to let people make their mistakes and figure it out, rather
Hmm.
than take that take away from them. So how have you found it? Like become doing this role.
Yeah, I think like every time I've made sort of a shift in my career to a different role, it's always a challenge. There's always like a ton of things you need to learn and mistakes you need to make along the way to sort of improve. So I sort of view this as the same way where it's it hasn't been easy for me. It's been different, but um, it's been really uh, sort of refreshing and energizing, like just doing something a little bit different. And it's always been something that I've sort of wanted in my career is pushing for more like sort of creative input across the whole of a project.
Mm.
Um, but you have to make sacrifices like with that, right? Because you can't work on everything like just zoomed in and being like, this is my asset. Like you don't have time for that anymore. But it's I think one of the most satisfying things is when you can provide like direction or instruction to like an external artist or an internal artist, and then you get like they show you like their next update and you're like, oh awesome, like that's exactly like the route that I wanted you to go, and it's cool that like this is going in the right direction, has improved.
What's more satisfying, just out of curiosity, when you get the update, so you give someone direction.
Hmm.
You're like, okay, this is what I've got in my mind. I've got this idea in my mind, and this is what I think it
Yeah.
is. And you get it back. Which is more satisfying? Getting something back, and the artist is like, nailed it, put exactly what was in my head. It's come to fruition. I am happy. Or it's like, I wasn't thinking that. It's not. You completely missed my cue. Completely, but I like it. Like, which is more satisfying to you?
um I mean, like, selfishly, probably the first one because I'm like, I had some control over that. But there's been so many cases where I'm like, I might have something like an idea in mind, and then I'll give
Mm-hmm.
it to an artist, and they do something different, but it's like way better than what I was actually thinking in my head, and then I'm like, awesome, great, like this is perfect, and then we can build off that, and I mean that's why. Um, I like to try to be really open like that. Like, I've worked with some leads in the past that are very like rigid and in workflows and how they want you to approach things. And I don't really like being like that because I feel like that stifles like creativity.
Mm-hmm.
And um, I mean, that's sort of one of the things that I've found like working at Counterplays. We're very like, we're not limited in like workflows and stuff. Like we're
Mm-hmm.
just trying to be very open with that. And at first I was like, okay, like every big tech company I've like big video game company I've worked for is usually has like very established tools and pipelines. So I was like, okay, let's see how this goes. And it's actually gone really well. Like we've got artists that work in Blender, artists that work in Maya, um, designer, Photoshop, everything. Like we try not to like limit any packages anyone uses, and
Mm-hmm.
um, usually get like it's worked a lot better than I anticipated. So
Yeah, that was the shocking thing for me so I've like obviously what onboarding processes can be like, and in fact speaking to my friends recently who have recently started new studios, the onboarding process has been really ropey for them, and I'm
mm,
like, okay, this is remote, they're on a different time zone to me, this is probably gonna be a rough week. And I remember I started on a Monday and I was up and running by like halfway through Tuesday, and I was like, where's the hiccup? There's got to be a hiccup along the way. And that was it. It was like a day and a half, and I was rolling. I was like, this is the
mhm.
smoothest onboarding process. This shouldn't be the case. It's a smaller studio, it's remote, different time zones, but somehow it worked. And I was like, this is a breath of fresh air. I was expecting a nightmare.
Well, that's sort of like rolling into one of the topics we wanted to chat about was sort of like working at a big established company versus a small independent company, and sort of the differences in your job role and your experience and sort of what to expect. And one of the things about working at Counterplay now, like it's a relatively small independent company, and we're all like based like all around the world.
Mm.
And one of the things that's been really refreshing is how quickly we're able to actually work. And I think that's because everyone is given like a ton of trust and responsibility, like to make their decisions, and also like to potentially to fail. I think it's super important that like people don't feel like they're afraid to fail, because
Mm.
as soon as people are afraid to fail, then it's kind of impossible to like to innovate.
Yeah.
So that's been one of the things that I've really enjoyed about like working at smaller companies, how sort of everyone is sort of got more uh, sort of creative input and trust across the board. Like obviously there are challenges with that, right? Because you make a decision and then someone might be like, why did you make that decision? And you have to justify your decision.
Hmm.
Um, but I've worked at like bigger companies that are more, they have larger teams and more specialization, and you're like working on an established franchise, and once you sort of figure out like the ins and outs of the art style and everything, and you might just kind of be doing the same thing, like more or
Mm.
less. Like you're not really thinking too much. You sort of get going to autopilot. You're like, okay, yeah, like I'm working on um, this faction type. Their main color is blue. Yeah, cool. Like there's a few like things that we need to do on this. Like they've got more scratches on their armor or something. I don't know. Like um, you just sort of fall into that. And then like at a smaller company, you might be. I mean, typically you're going to be working on stuff all across the board.
Mm.
Like it's very rare that you're going to just have like sort of one thing that you're going to be doing. Um, so that's one of the things that I really enjoy. I enjoy having like that variety in the work I do, where it's sort of like tackling everything across the whole game rather than just something like very small and specific.
Yeah, I have to admit I'm like that because I always say everyone who I speak to who like only know me from like sort of my art station or something, I'm like, oh, so you're a materials artist? I'm like, no, I'm an environment artist. I do all sorts of things. I do props, I do materials, I do lighting,
Yeah.
and it's like that's one of the things that's kind of a breath of fresh air. And what do you think about this though? Do you think so? It frustrates me when companies are like, okay, you're a materials artist. You worry about your lane. Don't worry about anything else. It's like
Yeah.
this person might have an idea. Like they might have a way they're looking at this problem that is completely different to everyone else's. But is that born, do you think, maybe from they're just an older company? Because like if you look at Counterplay, for example, before COVID and all this sort of shit, we were working fully remote. Like it was, and
Hmm.
how many studios get to say that? Like we're a fully remote studio. Like for I mean making a game as well. Like it's a lot less heard of. So maybe modern idea. And then we're also very autonomous. Everyone has the ability to move sideways. For example, me, I've been doing all sorts of stuff, materials, lighting,
Hmm.
environment.
Hmm.
Is this maybe a age thing where as a company is very old, it becomes more rigid, and it's like we have a way we've always done it, so we're going to keep doing it the way we've always done it. Whereas newer companies are like, well, there's a lot of annoying things about the old way. Why are we doing that? Don't know. Okay, well let's just not do it. Like, is that part of it as well that the older companies just have a way and that way tends to stick?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in that. I think it's really hard for like larger established companies to kind of to pivot as quickly.
Yes.
You've got a lot of people in a lot of like different positions and different seniority levels, and like my experience has been like everyone has to. There's got to be approval that goes up the chain, and everyone has to sign off on it, and so it's really hard to change sort of like culture like at big companies.
Mm.
Like you can, it just takes a lot longer, and that's one of the things that being a smaller, more nimble company, that's the advantage, is that because you can do that a lot quicker. Everyone talks to each other. Like um, I probably have more communication like cross department at Counterplay than I've ever had at any other company, because everyone communicates together, and it's less of like, oh, like this is my department, like don't talk to me unless this is like specific to my department and the work that we do. It's more like, oh, hey, like this area of the level, like what's going on here, and then let's work together as a whole team, a whole
Mm.
company to kind of like find a solution to that. There's more of that, which is really nice. Um, like compared to sort of larger companies where like it does depend on like the people that you work with, but I've worked with people that are in both camps, that like more people that are outgoing and sort of open to like getting out of their lane and doing something different and trying something new, and then other people are just sort of like, I'm really good at this one thing, like this is sort of like all I want to do, so I'm just going to focus on that. So
I think as well, it helps, and maybe this is going to come back to the outsourcing thing, but with say our studio, there's a lot of but everything's an open door. I at any point, so Tim Simpson, environmental director, as
hmm
an artist, to ground level artist, I can just go talk to the art director. Jesus, I could talk to Keith, the
yeah,
CEO, creative director, and CEO. It's like, Keith, I want to talk to you. I mean, I chatted with him yesterday. It's
yeah,
like, if we then transition that idea, let's transition it to a big company with like 20 studios across the planet. It's like, can I, a artist in the UK, go and talk to the art director? No, not a house cat chance. Can I go talk to the CEO? No, not a chance.
we could send them an email, but I don't think it would go over well.
It'll probably go through 3 people before I get to the person. But this also comes back to maybe the whole outsourcing thing solves some of this, because you imagine like, okay, it's like you've been on big projects. End of project comes, okay, we had 50 artists who were all production, like prop and asset and material
hmm
artists. We don't need these anymore. Okay, well, you all get to lose your jobs, which happens. It's
yeah,
one of the bad sides
yeah,
of the games industry. Maybe that idea of the outsourcing becoming way more of just a starter gig that you move up through, which I think is at the moment. I think a lot of people can treat outsourcing at the base level. Outsourcing is like, I'm going to work at outsource until I land a studio gig.
hmm
Maybe now it's going to start becoming, okay, outsourcing is my consistent work. I just finish the project and I move on to the next project because they're not tied to any one thing. And big studios have less churn because they only have these key people, problem solvers, asset artists, the lighting or whatever it might be. They're all, you don't need to churn so hard. And that's one of the things I'm like, okay, maybe that's the positive side to like this outsourcing thing, is the whole idea in the industry right now of churn, which is the one thing that terrifies every artist.
yeah,
No matter where you are in the hierarchy, it affects everyone. Is that maybe that goes away in the next like even more, where like big studios just go, you know what, we don't need to hire 40 in-house artists. We can just remote all this out to outsourcers, and we only have to keep people in-house, which we need. And I'm like, that idea, I'm like, I don't see a downside to that. That seems like a really good way of doing stuff.
yeah. There's like, I guess there's two ways of looking at it, right? Like if you do have that situation where you've got a smaller internal team that is relying more heavily on outsourcing, it means that you can kind of like you can keep that team around, and you don't need to
Mm,
worry so much about losing people, and you can sort of like hold on to like all that talent and knowledge and really focus that. I've worked at studios where they do like like a big internal ramp up, and they hire a bunch of contractors for maybe a year or a year and a half, and at some point you start losing all those people, and then you're like, oh, like so and so's like contract is up in 2 weeks, and they're like the only one that's doing destructibles or something like that, or something
mm,
that's like very specific, that like like that they're the only one on the team that does it, and then you're like, okay, like can we try and get them extended, and then maybe you can't because of just like the bureaucracy, and then you have to scramble and be like, okay, we have to somehow like do some kind of knowledge share, but that usually doesn't work too great either. And you end up just sort of wasting time ramping someone else up in that role. And it's not the most efficient way of doing things. The plus side to that though is that like, um, you give more people locally, like in the area you live,
mm,
like an opportunity to maybe get their foot in the door with like a shorter term contract like that. When you've got a studio that's only got like 4 or 5 like artists internally, you're pretty much only gonna look for senior talent. Like
mm.
there's not, you might have like maybe an opportunity for like maybe one junior role if it for something, but it's not a lot. You're usually looking for people that are either intermediate or senior, because you can't waste like
That higher.
maybe the hire, the head count, or maybe the production timeline is just so tight that you can't waste time sort of like ramping people up or mentoring them or teaching them,
Mm.
which sucks. But sometimes that's the situation. So there's like pluses and pros and cons on both sides of the equation, and I don't know what like the best solution is, to be honest.
Well, yeah, you make a good. I actually did think of that idea. The fact that okay, it's already quite difficult to get into the industry as it is. So I suppose if it's like okay, now to get into our studio, it's even harder because we only really want seniors. It's like yeah, I didn't think of it from that perspective. That's a very good point. But then again, you know, inadvertently, COVID might do the industry a lot of favors with you already see in studios now being like, okay, you know what? I mean, we were already ahead of maybe Keith's got like a glass ball where he saw the future, but it's like remote work. Like, okay, what's the main thing holding a lot of studios back in the moment for remote work? It's always a remote desktop and like security and all this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
COVID kind of forced their hand and said, right, you have to work. Okay, do something. And everyone's like, holy shit, they got us working from home in 2 weeks. I think that's the latest it took people to get from office to home. And it's like, oh, what are we going into the office for? Like, and I'm kind of thinking, I'm already seeing studios advertise this now, like, you know, okay, complete remote work, big studios as well. Like, it's not like these are Mickey Mouse studios. I'm like, oh, okay, so maybe this is what happens, is that remote work's more available, which has its pros and cons. Like, I'm a very sociable person. I do miss being in the office.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm now having to, some good friends I have who like all work up in Danbuster and Nottingham in the UK. It's like, okay, I'll drive an hour and stop at their place like every other weekend just so I'm like out the house and speaking to my friends.
Yeah.
But I think that's the way it's gonna go. Like that's the positive side to all this. It's such a trick. This is the other thing as well. As I see, it's weird. I spend too much time on social media. I shouldn't be on it. It's so toxic right now. But it's a lot of like, this is bad, this is terrible, we should just all do this. And like, for example, hire more people, whatever it might be. Yeah, there's a lot of ideas get batted around. But then when you made a very good counterpoint with the outsourcing thing. It's like, they think of that. These are really hard problems to solve. Like when you try to actually think them through logistically, it's like, these are nearly insurmountable. So it's a bit, I don't know if it's depressing or good. Because we are moving. The industry is moving. Just I'm not sure where.
Yeah, I mean, at least with like remote work, one of the things that I like the most about it is the ability to basically hire talent. Like you don't have to. It's so much quicker when you're just like, okay, yeah, you live on the other side of the planet. That's fine. Like we'll hire you, and you can be up and running in like a week or something, or maybe even quicker. I've worked at companies that are like rely heavily on international recruiting, like to get talent. They might not have like a lot of talent locally, or whatever talent was there is like they've already hired it all. So you rely heavily on international recruiting, and then you gotta like it just takes forever. Like it might take like on average 3 months to hire someone, because you got to go through all the different rounds of interviews, and then maybe you got to fly them out for an in-studio interview, and
and then there's America visas as well. That happened to one of my friends. Like he was going to go to the US. I think it was longer. I think it was like 4 months. He had like initial recruiter call. He then had the in-house meeting the lead or the art manager, then meeting like on, this was all via Skype, then meeting like the team, like the wider people. Then they flew him out, and he could. So the issue was he got the visa to get flown out because it's like a holiday visa. I think they treat it as. But then it's like, okay, now he needs to get a working visa, and all their months it went down the drain. He couldn't go because he couldn't get the working visa. He didn't go to university. He didn't have the accreditation. Very young, and I was like, Jesus, man, like. There's blockers in the way which aren't even your fault and you can't control, and it adds to the time. Like that was 4 months down the drain. We've got to go through another 4 months of hiring the next person, and it's
it's draining.
It's one word for it. I guess every artist as well. Like I mean, I know this was the case for me. It was like, okay, we're gonna hire you remote. Well, most of us have good machines. Let's be real here. Most of us, like, okay, not everyone, but like. We have something, so we've been creating portfolio work for this much time, so you have something to work on. Okay, yeah, maybe it's like not ideal, and you can maybe get like a better rig shipped out to you, but it's like even then, like I said, I was up and running in like a day and a half. I think the turnaround from my hiring was like a week. It's like it's really hard to argue. Like that's the bit which I find interesting. When you have these problems that we just mentioned, which are really hard to solve, it's like you hear the pros of remote work, these sort of turnarounds, all these kind of things. It's like, kind of hard to argue with some of them. And then there's also rent. You know, big office, 300 people, versus maybe an office with 10 people. It's
Yeah.
completely
Yeah,
different.
that overhead, the overhead is huge. Especially
Oh,
like if you feel like you're like, okay, like we have to set our studio up in sort of a hub that already has talent, like
yes.
LA or San Francisco or Vancouver, and those are all like high cost of living cities. So you're going to be paying more in overhead for rent, and so if you are like a remote based studio, you're kind of eliminating a lot of that risk. So it's almost
Yeah.
like job security is like a bit better because normally that's what like at the end of the day what puts companies under if they expand too quickly, they
Yeah.
get larger space. Now, oh, now we have room for 500 employees. Oh, a project was canceled and we have to lay off like, 100 people or something, and then
Hmm.
something else happens, and then you're like, oh, we've got all this space that we're not using, but we're paying for every month, and it's just little stuff like that. So, but I think that's
Dude,
just a challenge of like expanding any company. There's always that risk.
that hub thing you mentioned is such a killer. So one of my first studios, we're in like the center of Birmingham, and we're like, and it's expensive renting there. And it's like we had one floor and we're expanding so quickly. It's like, okay, we need to get another floor. Okay, we can't afford it, but we need to expand. And then obviously that leads to can't hire staff, so that means people are overworked and stressed. Okay, now we're gonna move to like a cheaper location. Can't take everyone, and it's like not everyone wants to move, and it's just like that center hub thing where it's like, okay, we need to be in a center hub location, but it's expensive, and it's like, but if we move to this remote location, a lot harder to get to, and but it's cheaper, and it's like that. Just navigating that as a company, like it doesn't matter how good your game is or how bad your game is. Sometimes just these
Yeah,
logistics of just existing completely
yeah,
cripples someone. And I guess then this is what cracks me up is then you look on like it's really hard for me not to get bag on gamers because they are obviously our market. But then I see like the reaction to games where you're like you're just not understanding the logistics that go into making a game, and it's like man, have a bit more appreciation. This shit gets made. Like we're
a lot of
over.
work.
It's miracles taking place to get this shit to happen. It's so bad. It's so frustrating. Um, what thing I do want to circle back to with asset art. I know it's like coming back full 360. What what sort of things? And I'm trying to figure the best way to word this because there's a million different ways we could look at this. The initial steps into the industry is always one to one. We've already established that. What should what's like the next step? Like we in asset and we're gonna say environment is a wider thing because they naturally lead into each other. Because everyone goes so at the moment, a lot of the mentees I'm working with at the moment is kind of a proper a one-to-one, and I take that into my environment, and then it's like okay, now I need to make 50 one-to-ones, and it goes into environment. And it's kind of like okay, maybe we can think of a better solution for this. Let's use some tilables. Let's use trims. There's all these different things we can look at. What's like? Is there? If you're talking to a new artist who's that example, they're making lots of one-to-ones and they're trying to make an environment. Is there like some things where you're like, okay, you just do this, just these 2-3 things, go look at and go learn before you even try this? Because I feel like there is a void of there's lots of learning education on creating one-to-ones. There's lots of it. It's good stuff. Um, but games are complicated things. And I feel like sometimes there's a disconnect, and that might be down to higher education or anything. But what key skills in asset
It's
art in general?
it's a hard question.
Yes, I know. So I'm
Like
trying to work the best way to ask it.
when I'm like mentoring and I'm communicating with like my mentees that don't have any experience, and they're like, what should I do for my portfolio? Um,
Mm.
there's usually like a few different things I tell them. Um, the biggest is always go smaller than whatever you're thinking. Quality over quantity. That you've heard it a million times, but it rings true. So a lot of times I'll talk to students that are like, I want to build like a whole level, whole environment. And I'm like, just build a room and then just like point your camera just at one of the walls and like
Mm.
just do that and do that really well. Um, if we're just talking about asset art specifically, like I'm going to be more interested in seeing like someone's portfolio with like one image of like a hammer that they've modeled, baked, textured, lit that looks awesome. I'm going to look at that and I'm going to consider that more over someone who maybe modeled the whole environment, but it's like not really lit that well, and some of the materials aren't the best. And like I'm going to look at that one shining example of quality,
Mm-hmm.
even if that person hasn't necessarily demonstrated that they can do everything in their portfolio. I'm a little bit more inclined to like go with that candidate and see if I can kind of teach that person, because I know that they can do, like I know that they have a good eye and they're like, okay, like I can take something simple but do an amazing job on it. Now it depends on the role, right? Like if I'm just looking for an asset artist, someone who's going to be doing modeling and texturing and baking, um, that's different than someone who's like maybe doing like level layout. You're going to need
Mm.
someone who's, who understands like composition. And if that's the role, then I'm going to be looking for someone who can demonstrate like, hey, I built this level, I assembled it, I lit it, like I understand sort of like player direction and how to lead them with light or storytelling, stuff like that. So there's two camps. It
Mm.
depends on what the role is.
I suppose one question, just a follow up to that. You mentioned like so scale down, let's focus on quality, not quantity.
Yeah.
What would you think about if you saw? I haven't seen many people do this, and I don't know whether it's more because it's kind of deemed as the art director side of stuff. Like when you see really nice concept art for big environments, it's lots of broad brush strokes. If you actually zoomed in on a rock, it's like it's a couple of strokes. It looks really shitty. But like on them, that big, yeah, exactly. But you look at the big picture, it's like this is a beautiful shot. And you get all the mood and the character. And I'm looking at this a bit more with like, it's how I'm kind of using Megascans at the moment. It's like, okay, I want to do these studies, these lighting studies, these color studies, and composition studies, where I haven't made anything. But even if I did make it, these big macro versus micro detail shots and designs and environments. As someone, if you're looking at portfolio, do you go, and this is for like, I'm talking like entry level. Do you look at that and go, oh, okay, that they've shown like some really good skill. Okay, they've probably shown some obvious skills, but do you consider that seriously to the application opposed to just, okay, that's a nice piece of art? Because in my head, I'm like, maybe that's a little bit more towards like the art director side of stuff and lighting artist side of stuff.
So you're talking about like someone who is maybe doing an exercise in composition or lighting, and they're doing something a little bit more macro, and they're like, here's like a scene composition, but then you might zoom in on those assets, and they're not going to hold up at sort of like a closer level. Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely worth it to do that and to show that. Like when I'm looking at a person's portfolio, I examine every piece in that portfolio, and that tells me a little bit about that person who's applying. So if you can demonstrate like, okay, this was an exercise in maybe like composition or color theory and lighting and more of a macro thing, and you sort of like call that out, or if it's at least obvious in that piece, and then you can also have an example of like, okay, here's a one-to-one prop that I made that's like really high quality. That's good. If you can only do one or the other, then I'm going to be like, oh, maybe there's a skill gap here. I don't know. So
actually, you're really interesting guy to talk to about this. I've had this discussion a few times with colleagues and mentees. In that, so our station, okay, it's not because I also work at our station, but it's the main portfolio site. And someone I was mentoring was like, okay, I want to get all my stuff on my portfolio bit. Like, everything I'm doing is in my portfolio. I was like, why? You have like a blog, you have the store page, the about page. Why? It's like, because no one looks at that stuff. They only look at the portfolio, the actual that initial
Right.
tab.
Right.
Now, as someone who's actually in a hiring position, do you ever pay attention to much of the blog side of stuff or the store side of stuff? Now, from my point of view, I'm like, I try to keep everything very well balanced, because I'm like, if to me, I'm like, if I'm ever applying for another material art role and someone's like, yeah, I don't know if you could do this job. Like, okay, all my stuff's free on the store. If you don't believe I can do it, go download the
Oh,
material and
right.
check it out yourself.
Right.
The blog, obviously, I do the podcast, but I also share a lot of like just shower thoughts. And in my head, I'm like, yeah, because when someone's hiring me, they might look through this stuff. Now, the counterpoint was, who has time to do that? If I get 100 applications, I'm not going through every single tab. So as someone who is at a bit in a position to, like, when you're actually hiring people, does that actually enter your mind, or you're like, okay, I'm just going to look at the art and I'm just going to judge it by what's on that front page?
I think it's secondary. I think it's one of those things where, like, maybe if I've looked at someone's portfolio and decided to move forward with like an interview, then I'll go back and I'll look at their blog and the store
Okay.
products and stuff like that, to get a better sense for like who they are before I chat with them. Um, I will probably I'll probably look at that stuff briefly, like on the first pass, right? I'm like, oh, they've made some blog posts. Like, I'll look through that, to get a better sense. But it is something that I probably wouldn't dedicate as much time to.
Yeah. Just good.
So
So
it's
I
a,
wanted to
so
ask that because it's. Sorry, God.
I think it's like it definitely makes an impact, but at the end of the day, like I care about like your portfolio and your quality of art is going to be the first thing that is going to make me decide yes or no. Like, so.
No, I just wanted to ask because I was just curious about the. I spoke to people of like various levels about this, and it's been so. I won't say divisive, but it's just been very different opinions, and I'm like, there's not much of a consensus on this. I wanted to speak to someone about this because the same came up about articles. I've had artists who are like, oh, I'm chasing like an 80 level or an experience points article because like it validates me, it validates my art, and I'm like, I mean, it does, but I don't know how much people pay attention because, if you just focus on making a good art, that's what they care about, whether or not you broke it down. And then their counterpoint was, yeah, but in the breakdown, I can explain that I did all the shaders and how I did things. I'm like, but why not include that in the actual post? If you're that worried about people knowing how you did something, put it in the post. And then it was like, oh, but it's almost like it validates it. Like, they don't need to think, they just see experience points and like it means something. I was like, oh, I don't know, does it? I mean, I've done it. I've wanted experience points articles. I've wanted 80 levels, and now I'm like a little bit more experienced. I'm like, did anyone actually pay attention to that? I don't know. I don't think they did.
I mean, it's good for building your brand and like getting your name out there, and it depends on the quality of like the breakdown, right? Like I've seen some that are really good and really informative, and I'm like, oh, this is awesome. And then I've seen some that I'm like, I don't like, how did there isn't really any content here. How did this get posted? It's almost like you're like, hey, like I had the article, but I'm not learning any information here, and that almost does you a disservice.
Mm.
Um,
I've got one final question actually. This is hot. This is spicy. This is the most divisive thing I asked someone,
oh,
and it's like it breaks friendships. Do you post wireframes on a portfolio piece or not?
like a wireframe, like
You have a textured asset. So say the hammer
yeah,
example you gave. Okay, I've got this hammer beautifully textured. Do I show my topology and my wireframe, a grey wireframe of that asset?
yeah. I don't think it hurts your piece at all. I think it enhances it. Like what I want to see is I want to see a fantastically like lit and rendered piece,
Mm-hmm.
and then if you can show a wireframe, but like not like a something a little bit higher quality than like a Maya screen grab or something from
Mm-hmm.
the viewport, something that's at least like tastefully done, then that's gonna definitely build your case. Like obviously, if you have good topology, like if you have good modeling, I don't know. I'm a little bit more old school. Like I do like all my modeling in Maya, like all my hard
Mm-hmm.
surface modeling. I do it all like sub D, old school. So I'm big into topology, clean topology. So for me, I'm looking at that. I'm like, okay, this will give me a really good sense of like, how this person creates their work. Um, but that's just me. So I don't think it would ever hurt your case to have
So-
it unless you have really bad topology.
Yeah, that's where it's come in. Is that so when I've spoken to people in the past, it's been like if you don't show it me, I don't question it. I'm thinking I'm just looking at the art. But there's been a lot of times when I've spoken to people, they've been like, yeah, but when you show me the topology, you kind of draw in criticism because it's very rare you see something that has like real perfect topology or like it's something to shout about, if that makes sense. There's a few assets I've seen where it's like, holy shit, that's low poly. I mean, that looks amazing. But a lot of the time, it draws criticism. Why have you could have killed a ring there, didn't need them polys here, and it's like, it's drew unnecessary criticism, and that's been the counterpoint to it.
Right.
I'm like, huh,
yeah,
okay.
That makes sense. Yeah, I mean, so I guess what I would say is, like if you are, like, don't feel like you always should have to post topology or a breakdown. If it's good, definitely show it. If there could be any of that like potential criticism, maybe it's not worth it.
It's just an interesting one. I've had this conversation again. It's one of those things where I've heard this one is divisive. People genuinely like argue on this shit. So I'm like, this is obviously some people are passionate about. I suppose what we'll wrap up this with is, you said you're a traditional guy, you use Maya. So when's the transition to Blender coming?
Honestly, it's been on my list for a while. I've got this massive backlog of like software that I need to learn. That it's on there. It's on the list.
What other software you got your eyes on?
Well, you're gonna laugh, but Substance Designer. I don't really know how to use Substance Designer.
How did you, dude? You Gears of War titleables. Like, I thought you used Designer for all of them.
Oh, it's all old school, like ZBrush sculpts and Photoshop and like using Quixel, the Quixel suite back in the day. Stuff like that. Yeah, man. I mean,
that is so good.
It works, but it's definitely slower. So.
I mean, I remember when I was at the time like a graphics artist / 3D artist, so like Endu and Dido, I was like, oh, this is just Photoshop. I mean, most of the time the plugin didn't work and didn't integrate Photoshop properly, but I was like, oh, this makes complete sense to me. This is Photoshop. And when Painter came around, I was such a critic. I was like, no, it can't be like Endu and Dido because they're just Photoshop, and who doesn't know Photoshop? And how wrong I was.
I think there's artists now that don't know how to use Photoshop. They only know.
It's very frustrating. It's genuinely irritating. Like, I've had Hannah, an ex-colleague, who we've spoken this at length, that like people who don't understand Photoshop at basic levels, like measurement levels, want RGB mask. Yeah, what is RGB? Like, and how do I pack a mask manually? We've worked on projects where we would manually like paint like stylized stuff, and it was like, you could do it all in Photoshop. Oh, I don't need to take that to Painter. Just throw gradient overlay on it and like, do some inner shadows, apply like some curvature bake on top. You're pretty much done. And it's like, oh, I don't know how to do that. I'm like, okay, how do you make your decals? I don't. I use packs. Okay. How do you edit your renders? Like, surely you edit your renders. Like, you had a sharpen or something. Nah. I'm like, that's bizarre to me. Like, I thought everyone...
I don't know. Maybe we're outdated. Who knows?
Yeah, that dinosaurs I mentioned, that's us.
I look at how things have changed in the last 5 or 6 years with how like my workflow has changed, and like maybe 6 years ago I was still texturing 3D models using Photoshop, like painting in 2D in Photoshop and being like, oh, the seams, there's a seam here, I gotta fix this. And at the time, like Quixel Suite was kind of just like coming out and people were using it more, but it was still like limited in its usability. And now the idea of going back and manually texturing something in Photoshop seems insane to me. I'm like, I can't believe I used to do that. That's crazy. Like,
yeah, it raises the base level. It raises the base level up, but I do find it's weird because our expectations are narrow. Like, because now I know you know this, but like you see machinery, smart material when it's slapped onto an asset or tank armor, and it's like, okay, compared to the Photoshop days, you'd probably be like, that's a pretty good start. But like now you're like, I know that took no work, so it's like the base bar has just been raised. Like the top ceiling, I don't think it's been changed that much because like cinema quality stuff still looks amazing. But that low level, it's almost like you have less reason to put out bad stuff, especially for the validation tools as well. Like, you have a button you click and it's like, okay, I know everything is PBR correct.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's what I've found is that, and now we've got photo scans too. Like, Jesus, is that like, there's no excuse for a bad tileable these days. You should, you've got Substance, Alchemist, and
So many resources.
Elixir. It's like you have no excuse. So the base bars has been raised and raised, I think, which makes it harder for, I guess, you as a lead, because you have to filter out that shit. Because it's like,
yeah, that's interesting. I was just gonna bring that up. Is like overall, like everyone's art is getting better at like such a fast rate, which is awesome. Like it's great to see like just how things like the baseline quality that you're seeing on ArtStation compared to like I can't remember when ArtStation first launched, but maybe 5 years ago or something. And just like the baseline level that everyone's at is definitely higher. But yes, you do have to like pause and think like, oh, did you actually like make all of this? Like, and and if they don't have a breakdown, then it's like, okay, like
or the tag, Megascan's tag.
Yeah, or something like that. So that's definitely like a challenge, like when you're doing hiring, because you're like, okay, like I want to make sure that I can hire someone that knows how to like actually sculpt and bake a rock, like not just oh, I downloaded a rock, a scan of a rock, and I'm working off of that. Like I want to know that you can make it. So I mean, I guess that is also leading back into like having a good breakdown of your scene or your asset, so that people that are hiring know like, oh, you actually, this is everything you did. And it's fine if you do utilize like mega scans or scanned assets of some sort, but like just not across the whole board, right? Like if you assemble a whole scene using Megascans assets, I'm not going to evaluate your ability to model and create assets. I'm going to evaluate your composition and your lighting, and which is all still valid, but for that specific role.
Yeah, I had this conversation with a mentee about this. It was like, is it okay for me to do like Megascan scenes? Because I've done one. I've done a Megascan scene where it's all Megascans and I've just focused on lighting and composition. And I was like, yeah, it's fine. Just bear in mind how it's going to be perceived. Like, what are you applying for? A prop artist? Well, you show me no prop art skills. And be aware as well, I'm going to be like, so when you evaluate a prop and you're like, okay, like, how PBR correct is it? The bakes, the modeling, texel density, how we get really granular in terms of how we critique a prop. Expect that level of granularity when I'm critiquing your composition, your lighting, placement of assets, eye rest versus like noise. It's like, expect me to critique it as hard as I critique a normal prop. And if you think I'm being harsh, it's like, yeah, well, you're playing with Lego at this point. I expect this to be as much effort as a prop.
It's almost like you expect more when someone does that. Yeah, like 100%. It can be less easygoing on them. If they were to build the whole thing from scratch, you could be like, okay, maybe the composition isn't the best here, but hey, they've like, they've built this all from scratch. They've done some shader work, like there's some nice texturing here. But if they do the whole thing using like scanned assets, you're like, this better be really good, like composition.
The one which gets me, and I bless his soul, I'm not going to name his name, but I grilled him because he basically we were doing a mentorship and he did a full scan scene, like everything was scanned, and he put some of his own props in there, and he had a long way to go with his props, put it that way. And I was like, dude, you gotta understand, I spot this a mile off, and this is hurting you so bad, because I'm like, well, if Megascans is the limit, is the standard, like we want things to look this good, all you're doing is saying this is how much lower I am compared to the Megascans, because you're just not doing yourself favors. I mean, there's a couple of hero props as well, and they're like, next one is Megascan stuff, and I was like, I spot that a mile off. And I guess that's the challenge as a lead as well, is like, is this Megascans, is it not? Because Kurt did this the other day. I was looking through some reference packs with Kurt, and I was like, are these Megascan scenes? Like, it had that saturation and look to maybe be a Megascan. So I was like, no, it's a photo. I was like, oh god, if we get to this stage where I mean, I like to think I have a good eye, and I was like, I think I recognize that clip from the pack. No, it's a photo. I was like, shit, my eyes failed me here. But it's
happening, man. It's happening.
It's scary. I don't like it. I like to like know things and like be able to look at something and make a judgment call, not be like, is this real life or fantasy? If it looks bad, it's probably real life.
Yeah, probably.
Real life's boring.
That's sort of now like the like our challenge as game artists is as we approach realism is sort of like not just making it look real, but like how do you enhance realism, like to make it interesting.
Well, as game artists, we've always had to go past real anyway. Like, if we went with real life, A, real life is boring,
Yeah.
and B, real life is not readable. Like, if we take a vehicle, you've done a lot of vehicles, it's like you have to push the bevels just a little bit further. We have to push the albedo a little bit further. We have to have AO in the albedo until we're like actually PBR full. It's like we have to do all these things because real life does not read well. Like, we need our games to read while we're running through an engine.
Usually pretty boring. Like,
yeah, I'm looking at my window now. It's like great. Maybe it's because I'm in England. It's like grey skies, nothing dramatic, so flat. And I'm just like, imagine if I took this photo and I'm like, okay, this is an environment. What do you think? Oh, no contrast. That's really noisy. This is really boring. You need to have some detail there. This tileable looks ugly. I mean, look, I was speaking about this last week actually. The amount of game dev memes in real life, like bad duplication of assets, non-tileables, bad light maps. These exist in real life. And I'm like, I'd get grilled by my leads if I did this. I suppose that's a nice place to leave off. Evan, man, I really appreciate you coming on and having a chat. It's been really fun. And also, it's one I've been wanting to have for a while for the viewers, because I think this conversation I've not managed to have with anyone yet, and you've been an ideal candidate for it. So I really appreciate taking the time to come on.
I hope people learn something.
Fingers crossed. Everyone, remember to like, follow, subscribe, share, because the more it gets shared, the more people get to listen to the fantastic information people like Evan have to say. But we're going to wrap up. I'll see you next week, guys. Dude, thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me, man.